Hey everyone, my name is Christian Jackson. Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays with CJ. I am your licensed mental health and wellness professional homegirl and daddy issues expert. So excited to have you guys here with me this evening. If you haven't been following the last few weeks, I have been consistently on here sharing tidbits about mental health and just things that are happening as of last week, pretty current events, right? And how that impacts our mental health. So this is just a space for us for like the next 20, 25 minutes for us to kind of sit together and have discussions. You can watch the replay, go in the comments. I have no qualms about engaging with you even afterwards. So thank you guys for rewatching, sharing the videos, giving me suggestions on what we can talk about here on Wellness Wednesdays with CJ, because I am here for it. We're in this together when it comes to what we are trying to do, which is at least my charge as Christian Jackson, the licensed professional counselor, is to make sure that people are getting the mental health information they need. So if anything, hopefully this is a bridge to what you may have not realized you needed, which is some therapeutic help and support. So I always get conversations started in DMs or random people kind of hit me up and asking me for advice of even how to find a therapist or to find one. And so I've been gracious enough to meet some people who have trusted me to kind of vet referrals and like try to find profiles that I think are appropriate based on what they need. I am a licensed therapist and a trauma specialist. That's pretty much my jam and the lane that I stay in when it comes to therapy. So I own a private practice and do a lot of individual work. And so most recently, what I've been able to do is launch a movement based on my books, Daddy Issues, How to Detangle from the Sins of Our Fathers. And so this is my baby, right? And this is her sister, both of my babies, because what I did was out of an emotional trauma and difficult relationship with my own father, I wrote this piece so that it's a manual for other women who are dealing with difficult relationships with their fathers. And so there is really a lot of things that come on my couch, people I meet. And so I was doing a lot of the same work with women and trying to find out what's going on with their family of origin. I found a lot of patterns and trends, and frankly, related to a lot of the women who were kind of triggering me in their own sessions for their daddy issues. So I would go to therapy, journal, do some things. Some of the book is really kind of where some of my journal entries kind of, but I tell my own story and I make sure that I share the stories of the women that I see, obviously kind of jumbling it up because I have a license and HIPAA does not allow you to kind of offer personal health information, but they're illustrating what daddy issues look like. I have a diagnosis that I made up basically based off of separation anxiety and reactive attachment disorder so that we can really paint the picture on what makes up daddy issues. So you got your abandonment, rejection, attachment issues, meaning what is getting in the way of me having a secure bond with someone outside of myself, whether it's marriage or dating or friendships or motherhood relationships or mentorships. You may be kind of forging ahead and molding leaders. And so we have to look at how daddy issues even impacts our future generations. So the book is really great so that you can have some self-reflection questions in between each chapter. So the workbook actually gives you more questions that are even based on what you see here in the book, and you have more space to write and journal and really kind of process what's going on. So I'm really excited about offering these two pieces for you. She's almost a year old to you guys. I've been writing her since probably 2018, finished it in like 2019, early 2019, or something like that. I might be like a year off. But what I'm most excited about is the fact that I'm able to start live groups with a specialized curriculum found here in the book. And I'm so excited because we have a few days. As of today, it is April 21st. 2 days from now, I'll have my final conversations with women who may want to join the Daddy Issues Healing Circle, which is the group that I'll be leading based on my books. Really excited for that feedback I've been getting and women who are excited and serious about engaging with other women and myself as a professional and the group facilitator, right? So I'm really pumped about being able to help support women and hold space for these women who are ready to do this thing, right? So I'm really pumped because I'm already planning and getting things together for the Healing Circle. If you would like to apply, you can obviously go to my website, www.couchwithchristian.com, to apply for the Daddy Issues Healing Circle by scrolling to the bottom of the homepage, filling out an application, and I will get right back with you so we can have a video chat and we can have a face-to-face connection so I can help figure out if this is a good fit for you, because I'm really all about keeping all the women safe who are in the group. So I have one conversation tomorrow with someone, and hopefully if someone else wants to jump on board by this Friday the 23rd, then that gives me enough cushion to make sure I have some time to make sure that everything is safe and ready to go for this group. So now that I'm done with my commercial, I really want to get into what happened yesterday. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the verdict for DC, but I'm not even going to say his name. I'm going to say George Floyd's name, right? We're going to talk about the excitement that is surging across America because of the fact that there was justice served from the execution, which is what I like to call it, what it is, right? We're going to call it what it was, the murder of George Floyd last May of 2020. And so a verdict was rendered, and I want to just say hooray for that. It is so important for the culture, for the Black community especially, because last week I did talk about something that happened very close to home. I'm here in Columbia, South Carolina, and there was a white officer that assaulted a young Black man who was defenseless. And so he was arrested and also in a space where he is being federally and locally investigated so that he is being held accountable for his uncalled for actions, right? So last week I talked a lot about that and how that really does take a toll on one's value, especially Black people and young Black boys who are coming up and watching that. So important for us to see that justice does apply to us too. So shout out to the verdict. So excited that on all counts, DC was held accountable. And so we got 8 weeks before we figure out the sentencing. And so we'll be following that story to see what happens. But hopefully this is a victory for us as a country. Not so sure it's going to unify us anytime soon, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. I also wanted to say, although this is an amazing thing and we really want to sit in that moment for that victory, unfortunately, there was a young woman who passed away today. She was murdered by a white police officer, shot 4 times in Ohio. She's a 16-year-old baby, y'all, murdered today. So even though we have these victories and we can have these conversations about how we're making change and moving in the right direction, unfortunately, if it's not one thing, it's another. And so we're exposed to all these things. It's so important for us to realize that it's key, it's so crucial to take care of yourselves in this time because these things happen more often than we can count. We have so much access to cameras and we have all of our own platforms. So we're all really exposed on our timelines and things like that. So I want to bring up the question that I just kind of left you with last week, which is how are you taking care of yourself? It is so crucial for you to do that because our timelines are flooded with all kinds of bad news, right? And unfortunately, we are all feeling that grief and mourning at the same time, even if it's not someone that is directly related to us, right? We don't have to be directly related to someone to really feel the weight of that grief and to mourn for someone. So I have some notes here. I wanted to just kind of give a couple of tips before I get into grief because that's what I want to touch on today. How are you taking care of yourself? Because I think it's important that you know you can do your part for you and make sure that that is priority because you're not able to take care of anyone else or really do what you feel kind of emotionally charged or responsible to do as a citizen if you don't take care of yourself. So if you do get super sensitive and react sensitively to this kind of information, then I would recommend that you make sure you decrease the social media usage that you have going on. If you're on your timeline, figure out who you're following that may kind of be tugging on those trauma responses because frankly, watching all of these things is pretty heavy. It's really hard. So consider what you're watching on TV, who you're spending your time with. This will give you an opportunity to really look at the boundaries that you might need to set and consider doing those things as you are kind of navigating life when it comes to what you are exposed to. Because there's already so much going on and this information that's going on your timeline like this. So like I said, literally from one day to the next, we were celebrating one moment and now unfortunately a 16-year-old girl was fatally shot today 4 times. And so we have to be careful to make sure that we are not feeling guilty for not doing anything, right? So there are some people who are putting pressure on others about what you're going to do, right? And so last week I talked a little bit about my friend and colleague, Tina Phillips. She and I are doing our part in our lane by really going to the providers who are giving services in the mental health sector for young Black and brown boys. So we have a pretty famous training here in the state, Boys in the Hood. We're actually doing it tomorrow morning. We chopped it down a lot just to kind of give us a quick snippet of what we can offer and help with. But doing my part means I'm coming to you weekly and talking about self-care and mental health because those are the things that we're not having conversations about enough. So if you feel guilty, like you have a tug in your spirit that says you got to do something, maybe that's something you can lean into for yourself, right? So we don't have to do things on these huge levels like we have to go lobby at the state house on the grounds. What are you doing for yourself so that you actually are recharged and energized enough to take care of bigger things if that's what you decide to do? Having these conversations, especially among the Black community who do not necessarily trust the system or trust people like me who are part of the system at times and, don't really kind of offer the support that one would expect. Have the conversations in your home about self-care and what you're doing. Destigmatize what comes with mental health. So May is Mental Health Awareness Month. I'm really excited for that, to roll some things out and some facts and tips about how to have certain conversations. Doing your part when managing your expectations and all the overwhelming emotions that comes with watching all the things on the news about Black people being murdered is so crucial. Doing your part. What do you need? Because that tug in your spirit is a cue that we all need to lean into and stop ignoring when it comes to our own mental health. And so those are just a couple of tips I wanted to give specifically in regards to what's going on in the news. Please, you guys, take care of yourself because grief is a real thing. I am reading a book by Alan Wolfelt. It's called The Wilderness of Grief, and it's giving some really great metaphors talking about grief as it relates to walking in the wilderness. So he's opening up this book and painting the metaphor, equating walking in the wilderness and kind of the unpredictable terrains of grief to the daily changes and second by second changes in wilderness, right? So we have to think about how grief is not something that is predictable. It's not something that we can kind of get ready for unless we are engaging in consistent self-care. So the book is great. I'm almost done with it. What he's doing is giving you 10 what he calls touchstones in dealing with grief. And these are just kind of markers, trail markers along your path in wilderness or grief that can kind of help anchor you along the way as you are healing, right? And so what I'm taking away from the book so far is some things I wanted to share with you, especially with the loss of an icon a few weeks ago, I guess 3 weeks ago by now, 2-3 weeks ago by now, DMX died. I wanted to mention him last week. And of course, again, just like our timeline goes so quickly, there's always new news. And unfortunately, some things get lost. So I didn't want to leave this broadcast without talking about the fact that we're all living a collective grief and trauma in the loss of icons as well. So anybody on whatever level, on whatever social class or whatever influence, they still tug on our spirits when we lose them, right? So one of the things that I'm thinking about that I took away from reading the book so far is that he's talking about making grief a friend. And I don't know, and you can let me know in the comments if that's something that you would ever consider. When I'm doing work with people in private therapy or my practice, individual therapy, and we're talking about emotions and what that can look like, we're talking about depression. I have some of my clients, I do have most of my clients who are in that conversation. We personify these emotions. So one of my clients, I'm going to project the name. This is a made up name, but she names her depression Natalie. I'll just call it Natalie. So are you naming these things so that you can take control of it? Having relationships with our depression, with our anxiety. It seems a little weird, a little off, but what it does is kind of get our brain going in that perspective and kind of tricking our brain to say, okay, I need to think about this in this way so that I can feel like I have control. So if you know, relationships obviously are difficult, but they are manageable in that we can mostly manage our expectations, know how to respond to, we can talk to these people. So in the same way, the author of this book, The Wilderness of Grief, what he's doing is telling us to kind of take our control back. Look at grief as a friend because grief and loss are inevitable. They're going to happen. The only thing that's constant in life is change, and that does include the loss of someone to death, which would be grief. And so what he's talking about is, setting the intention to heal. And what I really liked about what he said about intentions was the fact that it is a conscious decision to how we want to experience something. So if you're setting your intentions for the day, which I mentioned earlier on my social medias this week, what are your intentions when it comes to grief? If you're going to befriend grief and really have a relationship with grief and lean into all those negative, sometimes overwhelming emotions that grief kind of comes with, then what are your intentions in this space? And so I love how he's painting this picture that if we lean into it and not ignore what grief is trying to tell us, then we can have more control of what our experience with grief could be like. He's also differentiating between what grief and mourning are. And so grief is the definition, it's like our self-talk, our inward loss and self-talk regarding the person that passed away. And so grief happens inwardly, and he says mourning is the outward expression of grief. So the mourning is the sobbing and the crying and the, oh my God, I'm questioning my spirituality and why and who am I and identity issues. That outward expression of all the things that we tell ourselves when someone passes away is mourning. So there's a difference, right? Because we want to make sure that mourning is going to attract people who are going to be supportive. So, of course, later in the book, he's talking about how we can look for support, garner support in those efforts, make sure we're busting down myths and letting people know that we are grieving in unique ways, right? One of the things I think is important that I took away from this book is so far is that we always think about the stages of grief, right? We have commonly kind of known in the field and even just in people who are not in the counseling field about what the stages of grief are. Stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief by Dr. K. Ross, are denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then acceptance, right? So the important piece that we all need to remind ourselves of is where this theory comes from. So Dr. K. Ross was developing this theory and came up with these stages because she was watching people who were in hospice and dealing with terminal illnesses. So she watched all these people go through these stages and found patterns. It gave us a great framework when it comes to kind of explaining the unexplainable, right? Because we want answers when we're in situations where we're overwhelmed with trauma. More recently, there have been the 7 stages of grief, which kind of expound upon those 5. And it kind of brings up the shock and disbelief piece to the denial, the first stages of grief. So what we need to know about grief is that in the stages, anyway, is that they're not linear. One of the things that I think is important for us to realize is that we can go back and forth. It's kind of a cyclical motion. Something that Alan writes about in the Wilderness of Grief book that I'm talking about is the fact that we are going to likely feel waves of grief and pains of pain, right? And so we can't just say, okay, I'm done with this stage and that's it. What he's talking about throughout the book is reconciling with the grief that we're experiencing. And the mourning, again, that outward expression of our grief is us moving through and moving towards the wilderness, right? So grief is what he's calling it, a gift, right? So it's really kind of maybe pumping the brakes on us because we go and we have, again, so many things in our timeline that are taking up our headspace and lots of things that kind of don't give us speed bumps through life and we're on autopilot. Something this major and so devastating for people gives us a chance to say, okay, what do I need to kind of revisit and reevaluate within myself when it comes to my needs? So he's saying, instead of thinking about stages of grief, think about all the different needs that you have along the way. And that reminds us of what we can do for ourselves, who we need to set boundaries for so that we have our space. What does that look like? How can you, again, make a friend of grief and ask grief, what are you asking me to do? What are you requiring of me, right? This is such an important conversation. I'm giving you tidbits and an overview because it is my belief, again, with everything happening in the news, that we have to figure out a way to heal. And as if we don't have enough to do, right? But we have to figure out a way, if we want to make a change and make a difference, to use these things to our advantage. How can you use the trauma responses that are coming up for you as you watch things on the news? If your body is responding first and you're not necessarily cognitively in that headspace, then how are you listening to your body to tell you what you need to do to pay attention? How are you taking advantage of these things? And this is how we regain control. I talk a lot about that in my trauma work with people, especially because trauma just takes control, right? It has our body going off in ways that we don't necessarily are used to. We don't recognize them. And so it becomes intimidating when we get to a point where we're just like, oh, I'm dealing with this grief. What do I do? I'm not really sure. So again, I like the concept of making grief a friend, because then you can ask the grief. And you can do so in such activities like journaling, writing a letter to the person who was deceased. If you don't know this person and you know that, for example, the George Floyd shooting and unfortunately the young woman who was fatally wounded today, what is that bringing up for you? Can you write a letter to them? Would that kind of help you with your grief? And then how would it kind of evoke traumatic memories for you, right? So we have to pay attention to what this grief does for us. Vicarious trauma, meaning the trauma that I'm experiencing, not as a direct victim, but the trauma that I'm feeling because I watch people get murdered on TV in real life. That is a real thing, right? So I'm wondering if I'm dealing with grief as someone who doesn't even know George Floyd and never did. then how is this relating to my stuff? Why is it touching my things, right? What is it triggering for me? So traumatic grief is going to bring up a lot of the PTSD symptoms that I talked about before, and those are the legit trauma responses. So we get into the difference between what regular quote unquote grief is versus traumatic grief, right? Traumatic grief is going to evoke more of those PTSD symptoms. And what we're talking about is over time, how do we manage that? So, in the book, The Wilderness of Grief, what the author is telling us is that we have to kind of work towards the idea of reconciling grief, meaning we're not going to lose the memory of someone passing or dying. There are different levels of relationships that may kind of contribute to the amount of time that it may linger, grief that is. But what is it that we are doing in the meantime, walking through the wilderness? And so that's going to be really important. Again, leaning into these difficult emotions and asking them directly, even like again, writing a letter to them and really processing out what that looks like, asking what you want. Ask depression what you want. Ask anxiety and PTSD symptoms. What are you telling me I need to do? Are you saying I need to sleep more? I need to eat more? Because there is an emotional, physical, spiritual, physical fatigue that happens when we lose someone close to us. I think overall, knowing that everyone's grief processes are different is an obvious thing, but we kind of float over that, right? We know that everybody mourns differently, right? So I want to try to change my language. Mourning, meaning the outward expression of our grief. Everybody does that differently. So if we're going to try to do this thing in a collective way, with all the different rallies happening, all the support groups that are going on, the protests, those are people who are outwardly grieving and making a difference. But as you were doing that, how are you specifically contending with yourself? So I just wanted to expand upon the question that I asked last week when I was talking about the young man who again was assaulted very close to home. I'm here in Columbia, South Carolina, by the white officer in the military. I asked at the end of that talk, Wellness Wednesday last week, which you can go check out, how are you taking care of yourself as you're watching all these things happen on your timeline? We have to talk about grief. I think building that foundation is important because I don't see this stopping, unfortunately. I don't see this going away. There are people in your personal life that you will likely lose. I will likely lose. And so I have been running away from grief for a long time. And so I have to work through that with my own therapist. But I wanted to call to attention what this looks like as far as doing your part. And that starts with you. So define what grief looks like for you. The last time you grieved someone who passed away, or there was a very significant loss of a relationship, even what is it that you needed at that time, and what can you do differently to move forward so that if you again feel the tug in your spirit to make a difference, that you are actually doing okay. So that's what I'm going to leave you here with. Again, I don't like to leave y'all on here for hours and hours. Just a quick tidbit. If you have any questions, you can DM me or send me an email. I am at www.couchwithchristian.com. You can DM me at couchwithchristian on Facebook or on Instagram. And you can go to my website and figure out how to get to my YouTube and subscribe to that channel as I'm trying to get that kind of off the ground. I'm really excited for what you guys have to say when you come back and watch the replay. So please comment below and even give me some tips about what you want to hear about. I had someone ask about doing a talk about boundaries. So maybe I'll do that next week. And if you have suggestions, let me know. But again, you all, please take care of yourself. The world is not well. It never will be, but you can work towards and only control what you are doing for yourself. Y'all have a good night, and I'll catch you next week. Bye.